Hi, everyone. I want to thank to organizers for bringing us together to talk about such an important topic under these circumstances where we see a rising fascism in North America, which we would have been like surprised if we have heard like a couple of years ago. So I really appreciated that you have included me in the program. So what I will talk about is going to be about academics for peace in Turkey or within the colonial borders of Turkey. You have already heard about some of the complexities on the ground. So some of the things that I will mention might sound like repetitive, but I feel like under these circumstances, repeating things won't hurt anyone or anything. Before I delve into the case of the academics for peace, I want to begin by reframing academic freedom, not as a neutral or universally accessible right, but as a site of political struggle shaped by the entanglements of colonialism, colonial domination, authoritarianism, and neoliberal governance. Academic freedom is often celebrated as a pillar of liberal democracy, yet it's not evenly distributed. Nor is it equally protected, especially when it is used to name and resist state violence or to align oneself with oppressed communities. What happens when academic freedom is claimed by institutions complicit in silencing dissent? Or what does it mean to defend freedom of expression in contexts where solidarity itself is criminalized, particularly when that solidarity is extended towards stateless, racialized, or colonized populations? So these questions are not rhetorical, so they are lived actually, and they structure the terrain on which my own trajectory or academic life has unfolded, and they shape how I want to approach today's discussion, not through abstract principles, but through the concrete case of academics for peace in Turkey, whose collective act of dissent against war and displacement was met with extraordinary repression that you have heard some of like kind of complexities or forms of repression from my colleagues in the morning. Before I continue, I want to briefly acknowledge how I came to join this roundtable. I actually wasn't originally part of the program, and my former colleague from before the dismissals in Turkey, İsmet Akça, was scheduled to contribute by sharing his experiences as a scholar at risk, still living in Turkey. So due to the significant logistical and financial barriers of traveling from Istanbul, he couldn't be here and kindly asked me to step in, and I did, and I'm happy to be here. But it is important for me to say clearly that I cannot speak on behalf of İsmet or of the many dismissed scholars who remain in Turkey and face the ongoing burden of surveillance, criminalization, and professional exclusion. So their experiences unfold in ways that are deeply embodied and materially distinct from mine. I speak today from a position of relative privilege, I would say, as someone who happened to be in Canada pursuing my PhD at the time of my dismissal. So while this removed me from the immediate physical violence, it actually placed me in another form of precarity, which includes bureaucratical limbo, professional instability, and deep ethical discomfort. What I share today reflects basically this positionality, and I should highlight that I am not speaking here as a spokesperson for the Academic for Peace group, which is a diverse and politically heterogeneous group. But as I'm speaking as one scholar among many trying to make sense of repression we have collectively faced, and many scholars who are facing similar repression or authoritarian actions in North American liberal contexts. So to contextualize the struggle for academic freedom in Turkey, I think it's essential to recognize the state's treatment of the Kurdish issue as part of its colonial project. So I want to highlight this because what we have seen so far, we are just talking about those academics for peace who have been experiencing the repression, but we actually forget to talk about what those Kurdish people have been going through under the authoritarian or colonial state of Turkey. So I feel like this creates such tension within myself as a Kurdish scholar or Kurdish Canadian scholar that we do not talk about how the state is actually imposing its colonial policies on people, Kurdish people, within its colonial border, but we are focusing about middle-class academic scholars who have been facing this repression. So I think there should be a balance, and I'll be talking about this hopefully during the Q&A more in detail. So historically marked by forced displacement, the denial of Kurdish cultural and political rights, and aggressive assimilation policies, this project intensified dramatically after the collapse of peace negotiations in 2015. From mid-2015 to the end of 2016, the Turkish state launched massive military operations across northern Kurdistan, known as Southeast Turkey. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, hundreds of thousands were forcibly displaced, and human rights organizations documented extrajudicial killings, torture, and enforced disappearances under extended indefinite curfews, which I would say Kurds are pretty familiar with it, given the more than 100 years of colonial domination in Turkey. So it was within this climate of intensified repression that the Academics for Peace petition emerged in January 2016, initially signed by 1,128 scholars, many of them were Turkish. And the title of the petition was, "We will not be a party to this crime." And it simply demanded an end to the state violence in northern Kurdistan and return to the peace negotiations. But of course, its impact was immediate and far-reaching, because Erdogan's government treated this act of dissent as an existential to state authority, existential threat to state authority and the national unity. So signatories were publicly branded as traitors and terrorists. The government swiftly escalated punitive measures, which included disciplinary investigations, criminal prosecutions, arrests, detentions, funding cuts, travel bans, and dismissals. I guess we are now familiar with those given the situation in the United States. And to detail these forms of repression, the state imposed a lifelong ban on public employment, which includes positions at even private universities, cancellation of passports, including those of spouses, the marking of social security records with a stigmatizing code indicating dismissals by emergency decree laws, and exclusion from research funding opportunities and academic publications. So following the 2016 coup attempt, as we heard from my colleagues in the morning, repression deepened, as Erdogan referred to it, as a godsend for it smoothed the way for the institutionalization of an authoritarian regime, or what he euphemistically dubbed it as New Turkey. Under emergency rule, 406 signatories were dismissed via decree alongside thousands of other civil servants and educators. In total, around 6,000 academics lost their positions, with at least 549 academics for peace explicitly targeted, and I am one of them actually. So the Turkish state effectively weaponized the judiciary, deploying vague anti-terror laws, revoking passports, and launching protracted legal proceedings. So this was not just an effort to silence dissent. It was actually an attempt to fracture solidarity, to isolate academics from one another, and to dissuade any future collective resistance against the state violence. My own academic trajectory was profoundly shaped by these developments. So I had actually originally designed my doctoral research at York University to examine the political strategies of Kurdish forced migrants in two Turkish cities, one in Western Turkey, one also in northern Kurdistan. But by the time I began the field preparation, Kurdish majority cities had become active war zones. And there was an organization called Göçler, which is known as Pro-Kurdish Migration Organization, I had long collaborated with, was shut down alongside other 300 civil society organizations after the coup. and its archives were seized, and the terrain I actually planned to study was no longer accessible for me. And it wasn't just practically possible and ethically possible to conduct their research there. And I was in Canada at the time. Then in early 2016, after signing the Academics for Peace petition, I was formally dismissed from my position at Yıldız Technical University, and the government revoked my passport when I was here. Had I not already been in Toronto for my PhD, I wouldn't have been able to leave the country. So that's the privilege that I am actually talking about. So this sense of both distance and complicity shaped how I navigated my years in exile. And I experienced what some scholars call the survivor's guilt of being spared from the worst forms of violence while watching others endure the brunt of the crackdown in Turkey. Yet even in exile, life as a dismissed scholar wasn't easy, I would say. I had to navigate Canada's immigration system, adopt my entire research, and survive financially and institutionally within the precarious world of international academia. So this period also became time of mobilization for me. Alongside other signatory scholars at York University in Toronto, we mobilized informal networks and gained support from faculty allies, particularly from the York University Faculty Association, known as UFA, to establish short-term visiting positions for 6 at-risk scholars from Turkey. We also mobilized the union's support, and they were really supportive in terms of providing some financial support to the Academics for Peace in Turkey and the unions in Turkey. So this was kind of really fascinating to see how the solidarity actions can be mobilized internationally as well. But of course, these efforts, while meaningful, revealed the deep limitations of institutional solidarity, which I will speak more about it later. So what's important to emphasize here is that the repression we experienced was not simply a reaction to political protests. So it was part of a broader authoritarian neoliberal restructuring of higher education in Turkey. As many scholars have shown, and we heard in the morning, Turkish universities increasingly mirrored the state's ideological orientation, operating under a regime of precarious employment, performance-based control, and ideological policing. So surveillance became normalized under these circumstances. Students, informants monitored professors, and university administrations, far from being protectors of academic freedom, acted as direct collaborators in the repression of critical thought. So the consequences were not only professional, I would say, they are deeply embodied in lived experiences. So fear, isolation, and economic precarity became the defining features of academic life. Over 70% of academics in politically sensitive fields such as Kurdish studies, gender studies, and Armenian history, altered or abandoned their research agendas. And some of those scholars who finished their degrees abroad, their degrees were not recognized in Turkey because they would mention Kurdistan, the word of Kurdistan, or name the Turkish colonial policies in northern Kurdistan. And their theses were not recognized by the Turkish authorities. And in addition to all of these, the collective solidarity eroded under the pressure of individualized survival. Visa precarity, travel restrictions, and legal fragmentation created a patchwork of isolation and making it harder to sustain collective resistance or rebuild political trust. So the state strategies were very much intentional to suppress the solidarity or to dismantle the solidarity that was emerging among those academics for peace. In short, the Turkish state's assault on academic freedom cannot be seen in isolation from its colonial violence against the Kurdish people, nor from its broader authoritarian neoliberal agenda. Together, they produced a dual strategy of repression, meaning targeting Kurdish lives and political claims directly, while punishing those in the academia who dare to stand in solidarity with them. So it's basically from this context that I wanted to reflect on what academic freedom means when it's systematically denied, and how we might envision more just and sustainable frameworks of solidarity moving forward. So despite profoundly repressive conditions, I have to highlight the Academics for Peace generated powerful forms of resistance and solidarity. Yesterday there was a question about this, and I want to talk a little bit about this. In Turkey, dismissed scholars organized alternative educational initiatives. Most notably, it's called Bir Arada Academy, which can roughly be translated as Together Academy. And there were many street academies in many cities across Turkey and Northern Kurdistan and Europe and North America. So they were basically refusing to surrender their roles as educators and knowledge producers. These grassroots efforts challenged the erasure imposed by the state and reclaimed spaces for collective learning, critical thought, and political engagement. And they are very important still, I would say. Internationally, solidarity took the form of programs like Scholars at Risk, and I guess we are going to be hearing about it, which offer temporary academic refuge through institutional partnerships. However, these formal frameworks were often insufficient, marked by bureaucratic inertia, limited funding, and selective accessibility. Our own efforts at York University actually reflected these challenges. While we managed to secure 6 visiting scholar positions for displaced academics from Turkey, this was only possible through informal networks and the dedication of individual faculty members, particularly from UFA, not from a consistent institutional commitment. Even within these informal initiatives, structural inequalities persisted. Calls for scholars at risk often prioritized those who could teach in English and were already embedded in elite academic networks, typically Turkish scholars from metropolitan universities. So Kurdish scholars, often at greater risk and with fewer connections, were frequently excluded, and selection committees rarely accounted for such disparities, which basically reinforced the existing privilege rather than dismantling it. So scholars who did secure positions faced new layers of precarity. So it will be only 1-year contracts, low pay, unfamiliar institutional norms, and the urgency to build networks in an unfamiliar academic system, while also navigating immigration insecurities, and for many scholars, racialized academic environments that we are familiar with. So these conditions placed immense pressure on individuals to rapidly adapt while institutional support remained very much minimal. So these experiences highlight a key contradiction within liberal academic institutions. While many claim commitments to academic freedom or equity, diversity, and inclusion policies and global solidarity, their responses often remain symbolic. Statements of support rarely translate into structural changes. And institutional risk aversion, especially around politically sensitive contexts like Turkish and Kurdish politics, often results in inaction or half measures. The informal, individualized nature of solidarity efforts, while really vital in urgent moments, is inherently unsustainable. It reproduces uneven access and deepens precarity, offering limited stability or long-term integration for displaced scholars. Our experience underscores the urgent need for institutions to move beyond symbolic gestures. Supporting scholars at risk must involve structural investment, long-term strategies, and the courage to confront the political conditions that produce academic repression in the first place. This includes not only offering refuge, but also rethinking the ideological and bureaucratic architectures that shape access to academic spaces. Solidarity, to be meaningful, must be politically informed, structurally grounded, and collectively sustained. And only then can we imagine a version of academic freedom that's more than rhetorical, a freedom rooted in justice, equity, and responsibility. The experience of Academics for Peace, alongside our own efforts at York, reveals the deep vulnerabilities of academic freedom, even in so-called liberal democracies. While international programs offered temporary refuge, they were unevenly distributed, as I mentioned, and structurally limited. And institutional responses were present, often remained symbolic, as I said, but hampered by those reluctance to engage politically. This contradiction is not unique to Turkey. Since October 2023, as settler colonial Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza unfolded, we have witnessed scholars across North America silenced, surveyed, and penalized for expressing solidarity with Palestine. These responses mirror the authoritarian tactics we faced in Turkey, which means censorship, isolation, reputational smears, and professional threats. Such parallels reveal that what liberal institutions often conceal. Academic freedom is very much conditional, especially when critical solidarity challenges settler colonial, racial capitalist, or imperial foundations. Despite expensive commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion, most policies, as I said, remain performative and toothless, incapable of confronting the structural exclusion that indigenous, Palestinian, Kurdish, and other marginalized scholars routinely face. So to reclaim academic freedom, we actually must shift the frame. This is not about protecting abstract rights, but about building transnational, structurally grounded solidarity. That means rejecting symbolic inclusion in favor of collective accountability, material support, and sustained resistance. So at a minimum level, I would say this requires institutional emergency pathways that can quickly and equitably support at-risk scholars, particularly those criminalized for their politics. Then redirecting EDI and solidarity funds towards legal, financial, and professional support, basically not PR-friendly initiatives. And then challenging epistemic gatekeeping by expanding access for scholars outside dominant linguistic and institutional hierarchies. As scholars and activists, I would say our task is clear. We need to transform academic institutions from sites of complicity into spaces of radical care, justice, and decolonial possibilities. Anything less leaves the promise of academic freedom profoundly unfulfilled. Thank you, and looking forward to engaging more in the discussion from my colleagues. Thank you so much.